So now that we've had a chance to answer the questions, what is Azure? When do I use it? I'd like to turn the presentation over to Sai Shankar. He's going to walk us through a live demonstration of the Windows Azure platform so that you have a chance to actually see some of these main components in action. Sai?
Thanks, Jeff. Hello, everyone. Just making sure I can share my desktop here. All right. Okay, great. So hopefully you can see my screen here. I have an Internet Explorer browser open with the Windows Azure platform. So before we go into the demo, I just want to reiterate a couple of points that Jeff made in his presentation. When you are evaluating a development platform, you would need to look at the scalability and the flexibility of the platform. You need a place to store unstructured content. You would need a place to store relational content, which would be SQL. And you would have to write an application, either a web application or a Windows application, and then surface that data through the Windows Azure portal. Now, in most cases, you would also want to integrate other applications with your application that's hosted on the cloud. So in today's demo, we'll look at the creation of a SQL Azure database, a database that's hosted in the cloud. We will add some tables and content to it, and then we'll go ahead and consume that data within a web application that will also be hosted on Windows Azure. So the goal of the demo is really to show you how you can use traditional .NET tools for Windows Azure development. So before we jump into the development process, I actually want to show you what's available to manage your Windows Azure services. So what you're seeing here is the Windows Azure development portal. This is a one-stop location for managing all of your services. So once you log in with your live ID and you make a purchase on the different services that you want, for example, you buy SQL, you buy AppFabric, and you also buy Windows Azure, you would see all of your purchases available here in the left navigation bar. Now, you can create multiple projects and host them on these services as you see fit. As you can see here, I have access to these 3 different services here, and I have a project name called the Credera Azure Intro. So let's get started by building out a SQL Azure database. Now, there are a couple of ways to do it, and Microsoft is very mindful of the existing investments that you have made in SQL. So you can create a database either from this web-based portal, or you can also create it within SQL Server Management Studio. So in this demo, let's actually see both. Let's see how easy it is to create a database online and then manage it within SQL Management Studio. So I'm here on SQL Azure looking at the database information. You can see my server information here at the top. And creating a database is really a straightforward process. Basically, you hit Create Database, give it a name. I'm going to call it Demo 10, for example. And you choose which edition of SQL that you need. So I choose the web option. I get different options here for the size, 1 gig and 5 gigs. But if you choose the business option, you can go up to 50 gigs, which is what Jeff mentioned in his presentation as the limit. So in this case, I'll choose the web option, go ahead and create a database. And as you can see here, from an administration perspective, you are done creating the database. You don't have to worry about where those transaction logs are stored. You don't have to worry about where those MDF, LDF files are stored. All of those are taken care of you by SQL Azure so that your developers can actually focus on building the business logic and the web application surrounding the database itself. So I have created a database here. Now let's go and see how easy it is to manage this database within SQL Management Studio. Now, one thing that I want to point out here is there is a tab here for firewall settings. What that is once you create a SQL Azure database, you would want to restrict access to this because this is actually available on the internet. So when you create a database, you can provide an IP range for your company's network addresses so that your developers can securely access this database through Management Studio. I already have these rules created here, so I'm going to jump into SQL Management Studio. So as you can see here, the process is exactly the same as how you would connect to an on-premise SQL application. So I'm connected to this server here. Let me go ahead and refresh this. And then I should see my new Demo 10 database available here. Now let's go ahead and create a table and then add some content there. So again, the process is exactly the same as an on-premise. And I have a couple of scripts here because you wouldn't want me to see this being typed. So let me copy this. So all I'm doing here is creating a simple table, an employee table, applying an index on it, and then I'm going to fill it up with some data. So I have 6 rows here. So let me go ahead and add those rows. And as you can see from the scripts here, creation of tables, inserting data, all of those uses traditional T-SQL and SQL commands. So it's a pretty straightforward process managing a SQL Azure database, just like how you would do an on-premise application. Okay, so at this point we have seen how easy it is to manage this database. Let's go ahead and see the process of creating a web application and consuming this information. So for that, you would actually go to Visual Studio. So I have Visual Studio open here, and I have the Windows Azure Cloud SDK installed on this machine. Now when you install the SDK, it provides you templates that helps you in the creation of the cloud application. So I'm going to choose the Windows Azure Cloud Service, call it Webinar Cloud, and click OK. Now, when I go ahead and do this, it's going to go through a template and create the necessary projects for me in Visual Studio. Now, as Jeff mentioned, there are multiple ways for you to develop Windows Azure applications. So as you can see here, there are 4 different options for me. If you are developing a web application that's hosted on Windows Azure, you would choose the ASP.NET Web role, which is what I'm going to do here. But if you are developing a web service, you would choose the WCF Services Web role. That can be used in the Windows Azure AppFabric. If you are developing a background process for crunching numbers like the pharmaceutical example that Jeff mentioned, you would choose the background processing application. Or you can also do CGI web applications here. And as you can see, you can use Visual Basic or C# to develop in Visual Studio. In this case, I'm just going to choose the web role, go ahead and click OK. And at that point, the development process is exactly the same as how you would build a website for an on-premise application. So you can see here the default.aspx page is coming up. I can shift to the design tab. There is a drag and drop designer. I mean, everything is exactly the same as building an ASP.NET application. And if I look at the toolbox here, you can see all the components that are available for me in a traditional .NET app is available here as well. So let's go ahead and quickly build out a simple application that will connect to that SQL database and pull up that data. So I'm going to go here. I have some markup already available. I'm going to copy this markup, paste it here, and then you can see that there are a couple of things that I want to point to here. You see a couple of image tags that are available. This is actually leveraging Windows Azure storage. So I have a blob container in Windows Azure, and I have a couple of images stored there, and we are surfacing those using this unique address on Windows Azure, and then incorporating that within our web application. And as you can see, there's another traditional grid view, and basically we just want to use that to surface data. Go ahead and save this here. I'm going to jump back to the code, and let's go ahead and paste some code in so that you can see how to surface that information. So here is the code. I'll copy it, paste it back here. All right. I have a couple of references that I need to make sure that it's available. So let me go ahead and do that. Now my code is ready. So all I'm doing here is a really simple piece of code connecting to my SQL Azure database, selecting a list of employees from there, and then binding it to the website to display that information. So at this point, I'm ready. Let me go ahead and build this. And as you can see here, the building process, deployment process is exactly the process. Now what about debugging? Again, with the Windows Azure SDK, your developers have the complete Windows Azure environment available locally as well. So traditional tools like debugging work exactly like how you would in a traditional .NET application. So I start the debugging process. It loads the Cloud Services SDK on my local machine, and then I can step through and debug code just like how you would in a .NET application. So you can see here, really simple piece of code. These images are getting pulled from the Cloud Services SDK, from the Cloud Storage Service, and then here is the data coming from SQL Azure. So I am done with this development here. Let's see how we can deploy this to Windows Azure. So deployment again can be done through Visual Studio, but before you deploy, as a developer, you need to know what kind of target application do you, machine do you want to deploy this to. So you can see there is a web role here. Let me go ahead and click on properties. And then there are some helpful tips on how to determine your target virtual machine. For example, if you're doing a payroll application, you probably need a lot of virtual machine processing power. But if you're just doing a simple web application that does not have a lot of users, you don't need that much. So those settings are available here. So you can choose how many VMs this service is going to be distributed on, and you can also choose the size of the VM. So if I click on this information tab here, Microsoft actually provides some recommendations on what to choose. So if you have a really simple application that's okay to run on one CPU with a 1.7 gig memory, you would choose the small version. But if you want a large computing power to run a highly trafficked application, then you need to choose either the large or the extra large option. So all the other settings are pretty straightforward. Now let's go ahead and deploy this to the cloud. So I can right click on this and say publish. Now again, there are a couple of options here. This is completely integrated to Visual Studio, but you don't have to do it from here. You can just create the service package, take your components and upload it to the website, the Windows Azure Development Portal. But in this case, I'm just going to deploy it directly from here. So I would choose my credentials. And then once you do that, it's going to go to the website here, get me a list of all the projects that I have. As you can see, there are two different environments. You have a staging environment, you have a production environment that you can deploy to. So for this demo, I'm going to deploy it to staging and go ahead and click OK. Now, for the purposes of this demonstration, it's going to take some time to deploy this. So let me actually show you how a deployed application would look like. So let me jump back to the portal here, go to my Windows Azure section, and you can see I have a webinar demo, I have a webinar staging ready, and a webinar production project. So I'm going to jump into the webinar demo here. And once I do that, there are two different environments that you would see. One is a staging environment, the other is a production environment. Now, if you do a manual process, you can click on this deploy and then upload your configuration files to the cloud. Or when you do it from within Visual Studio, you'll see that eventually this one will get updated as well. Now, there are specific settings that you can set here. You can change which version of Windows Azure you want to run this on. You can upgrade the solution, you can suspend it, and of course, you can do some additional configuration as well. So let's go ahead and see how the staging environment looks like. So here is another of my projects. I have the web application configured and ready. You can see there is a unique URL here, and I can use this to deploy my application to the user acceptance testing team. So for example, you don't want to move it to production right away. You want to complete some user acceptance testing. You deploy it to staging, share this URL with your testers, and then once testing is done, you can go ahead and deploy it to production. So there is a unique URL and the application here. Now once you're ready, go ahead and click this option here, and you can promote the deployment to production. At that point, your entire solution gets packaged, gets moved to production, and then as you can see here from the screen, it goes through, it takes about 50 to 90 seconds, and then here you have your website URL that's ready for production. So you have your unique URL here. Go ahead and right click on this and open in a new tab. You can see that your application is now production ready and then available on Windows Azure. So just a quick recap, we saw an overview of the Windows Azure Development Portal. We looked at SQL Azure and how you can use SQL Management Studio to connect to your cloud database. We looked at how you can use traditional .NET tools like Visual Studio to manage and develop Windows Azure applications. And you saw how seamless the deployment process was from within Visual Studio. And for non.NET applications, you can actually upload applications individually. So if you're developing something on Ruby or Eclipse, you can do it manually through the Windows Azure Development Portal as well. And as you can see here, it's a pretty seamless development process and leverages all of the existing tools that you know. So I think that's all we have for the demo. So back to you, Jeff.